Okay, so now before we do compositing, I added a little light to the bottom of my ship. I did that by in the saucer, I added a new material, and then I tabbed into edit mode. I selected just that piece with L, and I assigned a light. The last thing I did was I added another sun. So we had one sun lamp, and then I duplicated it and added another sun. This first one was kind of pointing to the right and down, and then this is kind of like a fill light. So in the sun settings, I set that to 0.1, and it's kind of pointing up and shining underneath. Because if you look at reference images, the ship is always really well lit. So we didn't. This is what it looked like before. Let's see. So if you hide that, you get really dramatic shadows, so that's why I added another sun. Okay, so in your render settings, one thing you always want to do if you're making an animation, or almost always, in your sampling tells you how high quality. You can set your render samples to like 64 if you want a faster render, but always click this stopwatch, because it'll that noise you get every frame, it'll put the noise somewhere else, so it gives you like a video noise. So I'm going to leave that at 128 and set that to the stopwatch on. And the resolution we want is 640 by 480. That was the resolution of like your old TV screens, and set this to 100. So let's re-render an image. I'm going to go re-render an image. And that took, it says up there, 4 seconds to render, so not too bad. Let me join these two windows. I'm going to go back into the UV image editor, and in here you can go to your render result. You can also see your reference images, but go to render result. So I'm looking at my render up here. Down here, go into your node editor. And now we're not making materials. Like down here, the slot is set to materials, but if we switch here where it looks like two pictures overlapping each other, that's our compositor. And then click use nodes. So now we have our render layer, and we have the final composite, or the output where it'll go to like a PNG. So the first thing we want to do is I'm going to add a filter. So Shift A, filter. And a funny name for the filter is filter, and by default it's set to soften, so it softens the image, but that's like way too much, so set that factor to 0.5 or 0.25. And then let's add a filter glare. The threshold is 0.1, so if I brighten that light up a bit, because that light is only putting out 0.1, if you set the threshold lower, if you have a light, it'll create like a glow, and right now it's streaks, but you could switch it to fog glow and set it to low. Let's see, drop the threshold, increase the size. It's just adding a glow to that light. Then add a filter, and go so under filter there's distort, add a lens distortion, and if you just bump up the distortion, it'll start warping your image, which we don't want. But the dispersion is kind of interesting. Notice how it's like it's separating the light into the RGB, so red, blue, green, and the light frequency make white. So that's kind of cool if you like that. But if you do projector, it doesn't stretch it spherically. It kind of just separates edges. So if you were to bump that up to like 0.5, you can really see some separation there, but we don't want to go overboard. I think maybe 0.2, just something subtle. Okay, and I would say that is good enough for what we need. For this class, we want to make an animation. So I'm going to go back to my 3D view. I'm going to find my camera. Let's split the view, because I want one view to be my camera view, in this other view I'm going to use to move the camera. So if we want to make a simple animation of the ship just flying past the camera, you can just animate, go to your timeline, make sure you're at frame 1, and I'm just going to hit I. Remember the first ball animation, we input keyframes here, but if we hit I just in this viewport, we can insert a keyframe on loc and rot, which means location, rotation. So both of those, and then go to the end of yours. So 250 frames is 10 seconds. Let's make our animation 150 frames. Go to the end and maybe drag it here and insert another loc rot, so I. And maybe what we'll do is rotate the camera that way. So reinsert, and let's just see how this looks. So not quite good. It probably looked better if we just rotated it on the Z, insert loc rot, and if you go to the beginning, you can see your camera like starts out slow, it gains speed, and then it kind of eases in to its final resting point. And that's because if you go into the graph editor, you can see we have these like Bezier handles. So just select all your keyframes with A, and you could go up to key interpolation, but you can see there's a shortcut which is T. So interpolation mode. So I'm just going to hit T and switch it to linear. So it's a linear speed the whole time. So if I go back to timeline and hit play, we have our Enterprise flying past our camera. To render out your animation, so before you render it, let me double check to make sure your animation will help the final product, but let's assume it does. You have it set to JPEG, create your output, so I'm just going to put mine in, make a folder by clicking that little folder, and I'm going to type in render 1, select that render, accept, and I double check that yes, it's going into my render 1, it's JPEG, I have my stopwatch set, and then just hit, before you hit animate, set this to 23.98 frames per second, because that is the frame rate of film. So animate, and so what it's doing is it's rendering first, and then it's compositing, it's adding our compositing effects, and then doing it over and over again. And then in your render folder, render test, let's see, I think it was in my reference image. So here it is, starting to come together. And notice how even though our camera is moving, our background is not, and that's just one of the qualities of having a background image as your world setting. It doesn't move. It only moves when you like rotate the camera. So, but it gives the illusion of your ship flying forward.